All right, so what I want to do today to introduce this stuff is to say, first, why in economics of ideas? Why do we even need a course especially about this? Then we'll talk about the nature of ideas, which in some ways is part of the answer to that question, the idea that ideas are sort of special and unusual goods, as we're going to develop, that have very different properties from how we think about certain other kinds of goods. And then I'm going to close by helping us think about spillovers and market failures. And I want to get across at an introductory level today the idea that this is an area where kind of our free market welfare theorems tend to break down. And that means that there's going to be a special and distinctive role for policy in the innovation space for particular institutions to try to overcome some of these market failures. So in addition to sort of it being a forceful thing, innovation idea, something that's driving dynamics in the economy, it's also an area where there needs to be an enormous amount of policy. And so that gives you a whole different sort of perspective. And there's so much to be discovered still and learned about what kinds of policies are more or less effective. All right, so without further ado, why a course on innovation? So, I think that the first thing that we would say is simply that the role of the advance of ideas is just this profound propulsive force for rising standards of living and increasing health and longer lives. This is showing kind of rates of increases in income per capita in real terms from different centuries, but going back to the 11th century, and you can see in the 19th, and then of course in the 20th, we see a much more rapid expansion. This of course begins with the Industrial Revolution and on to the 20th and now the 21st as we move towards, AI as perhaps the latest of a series of general purpose technologies that have been part of this explosive, ahistorical, from a prior perspective, rapid expansion in standards of living. Now you can try to get at to why do we think ideas matter here, and you could sort of get into macro kind of residuals and various kinds of arguments. My colleague here at Northwestern, Joel Mokyr, who just won the Nobel Prize this fall. His book, The Lever of Riches, which I read during my PhD and I recommend to you strongly, is a really beautiful sort of technology by technology take about how advancing ideas and embodied and often in physical capital equipment have greatly advanced productivity, and it's a very sort of direct take on how important ideas have been throughout this period, and particularly in the Industrial Revolution. So I recommend that to you. But I think even the more powerful arguments for why we should think about ideas is just think about a particular sector of the economy and think how it's changed. And so I'm showing you a few examples here. You have on the top transportation, right? So in the middle of the 19th century, rather 1850 or so, kind of before trains and automobiles and airplanes, you wanted to get places, there was often livestock. You were riding a horse or being pulled by a horse, or in the case of the United States, if you wanted to go west, you might be being pulled by oxen, who are going to be both, your propulsion, but also possibly your food, because it's going to take like 6 months. So I'm sitting here in Illinois in the middle of the country. To get from Illinois to California on the west or Oregon on the west took something like 6 months, and it was very slow. It was very dangerous. You had to bring your own food, etc. Very uncomfortable, and all these families were traveling west. Today, you can make that journey in less than 6 hours on a jet-powered airplane. So 6 months to 6 hours. How do we make that transition? Through many intermediate steps, but obviously this is a huge improvement in transportation efficiency, and it obviously has to do with a lot of new ideas that didn't exist in the middle of the 19th century. Similarly, farming in the middle here, we used to do a lot of hand labor. You go back to the colonial period in the United States in the late 19th century, 80 to 90% of all people were farmers. And now it's something like 2% of people are farmers in the workforce. And that's in part because we've had incredible improvements in productivity through a variety of things, including mechanized agriculture and machines that can sow and harvest and process grains, etc. The bottom I have more recently, the role of computers. If you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, it's about a team of primarily women at NASA, it's a space agency, that were, as a job, they were called computers, because that's what they did. They would be computing by hand and with like slide rules, kind of orbital trajectories for launching satellites and things. And then they were replaced. They were replaced by actual, what we think of today as computers, which are machines. And at first they were replaced by an IBM mainframe, and then it goes on from there with improvements and improvements and improvements in computers. And of course, we know how much computing and the advance of computing has done in terms of the breadth of effects across sectors in society. And so so this change, we didn't get to our standard of living today by just saving and doing more of what we knew how to do in the 19th century. We didn't just, it's not more wagons, like we're richer because we have more wagons per person. There's something very different going on, which is that we're coming up with better ways to transport, better ways to harvest, better ways to compute, and those are driving massive increases in output per hour and advancing standards of living. Okay, so with that in mind, we're thinking about ideas which are sort of embodied in those pictures. Of course, in those pictures, we're actually not really seeing, we're seeing like implementations of those ideas as a machine, for example. Much of economics is, if you think about this picture, is built around the thing on the left, chairs. We think about like production functions and prices and markets and firms. But the thing we're talking about today and in this course is really on the right. It's like an idea. It's like the quadratic formula, as I'm showing you. So one way to encapsulate what we're talking about there in that distinction is that there's like a production function for ideas that might be or a knowledge production function that might be quite different from a production function for like ordinary goods or services like chairs. And, with regard to, just to put it in one slightly formal terms, but just very kind of integrative, I think can sort of pretty much everything you'll hear. I don't know quite what all my colleagues are going to tell you over the next 13 weeks or so, but it's going to pretty much fit into this equation one way or another in some kind of conceptual sense. And so, what is the output there on the left-hand side? We often think of DADT. A is some sort of state of stock of knowledge, or maybe it's a measure of productivity or health, like how long you live or your survivability from a disease. And we're trying to improve A over time. And so the output of ideas is a kind of an improvement in the standard of living through increases in, say, productivity or health. And then on the right-hand side in that function Q, I have kind of the natural inputs, which are H, human capital. So maybe like there's a lot of human capital going into ideas production, which might be distinctive from the kind of human capital that goes into ordinary production of like a car or a chair or whatever. Physical capital, like machinery, where you're going to use a lot of sort of specialized machinery like telescopes or microscopes or particle accelerators or things like that, or a lot of stata if you're a lot of R or whatever you're doing with statistics in economics. Z would be the kind of institutions that are going to shape incentives, rewards for creating ideas, which are very distinctive in science and R&D from other institutions in society. And then there's the current state of knowledge itself, A, which may have an implication for the ease with which we can continue to improve our understanding, and I'll talk about that today, and you'll hear more about that throughout the course as well. Now, I'm not going to talk about AI today because I'm just doing an introduction, but if you want to think about AI is K, right, where it's physical capital, and whereas, clearly the key input, a kind of a necessary input into idea production through history has been human minds. Like without that, you can't make any progress. You can think about AI as sort of maybe shifting some of that to K, and maybe it's really high quality K. It's very good at it, to be determined a little bit. But that's kind of one way to think about AI in some sort of coherent framework as well, how to organize those questions. All right, so related to this, as I said, if in my Z in my last slide, but just sort of thinking about the institutions and policies that support innovative activity. If you start thinking about it, it's a really wide range of institutions and policies that are really just purely directed at this sort of peculiar activity of idea production. So on the top, just to give a quick flavor, you've got the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, so like the patent system supporting private incentives to invest in research and development. Then you've got like grant funders for science, like the National Institutes of Health next to it on the right, and then or the European Research Council, say in Europe. Then you have kind of laboratories where things are actually happening. You've got like a kind of multinational collaborations like CERN for sort of particle accelerator. On the bottom, that's a picture of my university. I'm sitting on kind of along that lake right now as I'm talking to you. Lots of labs here doing things. Above it, Argonne is a U.S. national lab, so it's not a university, but it's an energy lab. Howard Hughes Medical Institute, it's like a philanthropic, very high-end health research lab, for example. You then have on the lower left, you've got government funders for more particular solution-oriented processes like DARPA, which is within the U.S. Defense Department, trying to come up with defense solutions to various kinds of problems. You've got venture capital funders like Bessemer. You've got philanthropies like Sloan. You've got private sector corporate labs like Abbott, which is trying to come up with new drugs or medical devices, right? So there's a really wide range of private, nonprofit, and public institutions that are coming together in pursuit of coming up with new ideas or funding them or coloring the incentives with which we do things. Okay, so to encapsulate the kind of first question for our course, like why have an economics of ideas? I think there are several answers. So first, because the advance of ideas informs central phenomena, it's this incredibly powerful and first order force in understanding the path of economic prosperity, which would include income and health, and also how inequality evolves between labor and capital, between different kinds of labor. It's about the dynamics of how markets, industries, and international trade go. It's about the role of specific institutions and policy that are suited and designed particularly for this somewhat peculiar space of idea production. The next thing, which we started to say a bit about, we talked about the chair versus the quadratic formula, is that there's something, and you mentioned uncertainty, there's something about ideas that are distinctive, and I'm going to try to clarify that in an introductory way today. It's really from those distinctive features that you can begin to build out kind of this more complicated and rich understanding of idea production and all of its features. And the related issue there, which I'll come to very quickly now, is that, because of these special features of ideas, it's natural to think there are very large market failures. So the market is not going to produce ideas correctly left to its own devices, and that's why we need public policy and places like the Institute for Progress to help think about how we can do that kind of policy better. Okay, so that was just the first introductory part. Now I want to talk about the nature of ideas, and I'm going to come to several features, non-rivalry, excludability, and cumulativeness. I'm not going to talk much about uncertainty just for the interest of time, but maybe we can mention it, particularly because you brought it up. I'll say something about that as well. But these are features that are going to underpin the kind of market failures associated with ideas. And in some sense, this course is going to be kind of, whatever anyone's doing, it's coming back to some of these features in some way that kind of are at the core of the nature of ideas themselves. Okay, so non-rivalry was mentioned. Let's just think about this very clearly. This is a somewhat odd concept, I think, when you first hear it, if you don't know it, and then it becomes very natural. But the idea here is that almost, most goods are rival goods. Okay, so a rival good is like a chair or a car or a computer, and it means that, like, if you're sitting in the chair, no one else can use the chair at the same time. Right, you're kind of rivals. If someone is driving a car, you can't be driving that same car somewhere else at the same time. There's tangible goods, most goods, and if you're getting a visit with a dentist and they're cleaning your teeth, they can't provide that service to somebody else's teeth at the same moment, right? So ordinary goods and services, we would say, are rival. Like if one person's getting the service or using the good, nobody else can at the same time. But with ideas, at the core of it all is this concept like the quadratic formula. Let's say I'm using the quadratic formula, right now to solve some algebra problem. Andrew could be using it at the same time. So could Matt, so could all of you. There's no sense in which my using the quadratic formula is at all influencing your ability to use and get value out of the quadratic formula. So that's non-rival. We're not rivals, right? If I'm driving the car, you can't drive the car. But if I'm using the quadratic formula, no effect on your ability to use the quadratic formula, all right? So we have the chair and the quadratic formula. And the point is that ideas have this non-rival property. Algebra, a kind of biomedical concept like the germ theory of disease. The use of an assembly line. Like once Henry Ford puts in an assembly line to make cars, every other car company is like, oh, maybe I could do that. Or you're making something else. I'm making, scaffolds, or I'm making chairs, or whatever I'm doing. I could use an assembly line. A chemical process, regression. We're all running regressions. If I run OLS, you can run OLS. Jennifer Doudna comes up with CRISPR. Now that might be patented and be a source of some debate, but when the patent at least expires, people can use it for free. And there's certainly, but there's nothing fundamental about the idea that would say that your use of CRISPR would make it harder for me to use CRISPR. Okay. Now, that property, which is really essential, is going to have these kind of very important implications. One, it's going to mean that there's a lot of value in ideas because it spills over. If one person uses it and creates it, it can spill over to other people. And that's going to lead to market failures. Okay, so this is going to suggest that, at least this force is going to suggest that markets are going to underinvest in new ideas. All right. So these very important things for the economy, but what if the markets underinvest? Then we're like not getting enough of this incredibly important thing. And so we're going to really want to care a lot about policy. Now, if it's non-rival, so like let's say one of you comes up with an idea and you create it and you write it down, you put it out in a paper. And everyone's like, wow, like it's a new method or a new insight or a new fact. Other people will be like, wow, that's really important. I'm going to start making use of that fact or model or whatever it is. But because everyone else is getting value from it, that means that you in creating it probably are not getting the whole value of it to society. You're getting sort of the value you used it for yourself. And then its value is now spilling over through non-rivalry to all these other people. And that's just kind of like, oh, okay, so there's positive spillovers. But where it becomes more problematic from a kind of market investment point of view is as follows. Because the first time you come up with the idea, let's say it's, you're going to write a book or you're going to record a music album or design, if someone said design, you're going to design a new chair that others can see. You're going to come up with a new pharmaceutical that fights a certain kind of cancer, okay? Often the act of the creation, like, writing a book is actually quite expensive. It takes a lot of time and effort. Coming up with a new pharmaceutical can cost, a pharmaceutical firm hundreds of millions of dollars to find it, show that it works, doesn't have bad side effects, etc. So there's this huge fixed cost of producing an idea. But then having shown it, if you show the pharmaceutical works, other people, if they could just access the pharmaceutical, they could just make copies of the pill, not having to bear any of that fixed cost. If you could make a book and everyone could just make a copy of the book and read it as a PDF, if you recorded an album at some expense and then everyone else can just listen to the music and make copies of your music and we all can listen to the same song at the same time for free, it's non-rival, then what happens? Well, then if you think about it, a market's going to make this really hard to make work. And why? Because here I'm showing you the kind of units of ideas produced along the x-axis here. But there was a fixed cost to come up with the idea. So for the person who created the idea, they've got this fixed cost of like coming up with a pharmaceutical, and then they're going to make more and more copies of the pill. And so their average costs are going to decline, right? But because of the fixed cost, their average cost is always going to be above the marginal cost of making a pill because they still have to pay off this fixed cost of producing the drug in the first place, right? But any entrant who wants to make copies of the pharmaceutical or copies of the song, they don't have to pay that fixed cost because they just make copies, right? Which means that if competitive entry happens, they'll come in and they can price just above their marginal cost and make money, but they're going to be pricing below the average cost from the idea creator. So what's going to happen? Who's going to win the market? Not the idea creator. They can't charge that low because they have to pay themselves off for the fixed cost of creation. It's the entrants who come in and copy with the non-rival ideas that can serve the market at the lowest price. And so what happens? The person who actually did the invention goes out of business from non-rivalry alone, if you let that be the dominating force. Okay, so in a context of non-rivalry, it's very hard to invent. At least you might do it because we're creative. Like I like to write a book. It makes me feel good. Or you're probably not going to marshal $100 million to make a drug because you're just going to lose all your money, even if you're successful, right? So that doesn't work. Okay, so this is kind of the first key market failure, and so we need to solve that. And how do we solve that? Well, we have to get to a second concept, which is closely related to rivalry, non-rivalry, but is really more of a choice. It's more of a choice of society, which is excludability. Okay? So the point is that ideas themselves are not typically naturally excludable. Like they're non-rival. They kind of want, if I heard about the quadratic formula, oh yeah, I'll just use that. But what you need then, if I'm just going to come in and use it for free, and I might undercut you who created the idea, we kind of have, in order to create a private decentralized incentive for someone to create that idea, we need to let them exclude others from using it, okay? So in other words, we need to give you something like a patent, right? So like if you did a pharmaceutical and I could come in and undercut you and nothing you could do about it, you would have no incentive to invest. But if I give you a patent as one method, I make you a monopolist. That gives you the right to exclude others from using your pharmaceutical unless you want to let them and make them, you could charge a license or a royalty to let people do that. But it's up to you. If it's my pharmaceutical and I have a patent, I'm a monopoly. I can decide who gets to produce it. And so now I can charge a much higher price and then pay off my fixed cost of investment. Okay, and that's of course a legal solution relying on creating an intellectual property, right? Okay, and so in general, whether you have excludability is going to depend a lot on the policy institutional space in a country, strength of the legal system, these kinds of things. It can also depend on the technology itself. So let me give you some examples. So again, the patent system is the most obvious form of creating excludability, right? Think of it like this. Ideas are non-rival, it's fundamental, but you can make them at least excludable. You can choose to make them excludable by allowing patents, okay? And there are other intellectual property, would be copyrights or trademarks, non-compete agreements, trade secrets. There are other ways to do it which cover different kinds of creations. And it's up to a society to decide how much legal protection we want to give to certain ideas and creations, how long the patent right should be, how long do you want a monopoly around, these kinds of design questions. The other way to go is not necessarily relying on intellectual property. A company or a person might get excludability other ways. So one thing is you can just make it really hard to copy. So the idea itself is non-rival, but you might encrypt it. So like an example of that would be like satellite radio. So if you're driving around, the satellites are sending down the radio signals on all cars, right? Everyone is getting the signal, but you can't actually listen to it unless you pay a subscription, because that subscription is going to give your decoder in your car the decryption ability to actually listen to whatever that channel is. Okay, so there we don't really need patents. They're just encrypting it in a way and then using subscriptions. So you could play a video game online peer-to-peer on some server, and they don't have to necessarily have a patent or intellectual property because they can control your access to the server, for example, and you can only play the game if you have access to the server. So if you can control some kind of necessary gatekeeping thing, or you can just keep it secret, and people can't figure out because it's like an internal process to your firm, maybe you can get excludability despite the kind of more non-rival nature of things. Okay. All right. So this is why we're going to have things like the patent system. It's because we need to create some kind of incentive where the market without that property right would not succeed. All right. Let me say something very brief about uncertainty, just because you guys brought it up, and then I'll go to cumulativeness. So with regard to uncertainty, we think this is an absolutely fundamental feature of ideas. And it's not just that, like, I'm going to flip a coin. Is it heads or tails? I'm not sure. There's that element where you're just not really sure. Right, and so like if you start a drug program, 9 out of 10 drugs, pharmaceuticals that go into like the first phase trial don't make it through, right? So they're going to sort of think they might work, but until they try it, they're going to fail most of the time. Venture capital firms, like 9 out of 10 bets are losers, right? They're going to kind of lose most of the time, and then hope that some bets are really successful and kind of on average carry the portfolio. But it's not just like you have a 1 in 10 chance kind of thing. It seems to be like we don't know, we can't even foresee the reason it will be valuable or not, okay? And so it's very, very hard to know. So let me give you an example. So the internet was originally created, the internet is kind of, before that there's NSFNet, and before that it's ARPANET, okay? So ARPANET, the kind of proto-internet in the US, was actually created by the US Defense Department, by DARPA, a research agency in the Defense Department. And what were they doing? They were trying to create a way so that they're a Defense Department. So they want to say, well, let's say we're trying to communicate with each other across our operations, but someone like knocks out one of our communications towers. We want to have a robust system of communication so we can still communicate. And so the idea was that you would divide information up into like packets, and then you would send it on many different routes through a network. And so if you lose one node of communications on the network, information can still be rerouted across all these different nodes, and people can still be in communication. Okay, so the early idea of the internet for them was like robust communications when you're under attack. Like that's what they were thinking. Were they thinking Amazon? Were they thinking Uber? Were they thinking, e-tail? They were thinking none of those things. And ARPANET was around for a while before anyone began to think, well, maybe this could be useful for something else, right? And so it's very hard to know which ideas are going to take off. All right, so the other feature of ideas that's very important, and comes up lots of different ways, is cumulativeness, meaning that, you create a spillover, it's non-rival, so like if I come up with a song, other people can listen to the song. If you read a book, other people can read the book. But it's not just that they can imitate or use the idea itself, it's that idea has an influence on future idea creation, right? So this goes back to the comment someone made earlier about math. Like sometimes math achievements that look very like, what's the use of that? But then later they prove really important because they unleash, further applications. Or like an advance in physics might lead to eventually a new material in material science, and that changes like how we design airframes or something, and on from there. So there's an intertemporal spillover, right? Another version of that is like you create like an iPhone, like a smartphone platform. Having created that, people can then write apps for it. So there's an intertemporal spillover on the ability to do software applications in general with computing. You have kind of from hardware to software, this kind of thing, okay? And so this intertemporal part seems very fundamental to knowledge, and one of the most, this is probably the most quoted line in all of innovation studies, going back to Isaac Newton, who said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on ye shoulders of giants." He wrote this in a letter to a contemporary of his, the physicist Hooke. And he's basically saying, look, the theme of this is that, yes, I can take a step forward, but I can take a step forward because I have the benefit of all the knowledge that's already been accumulated from which I can step forward from, okay? And so let me ask you another question here. Then if knowledge is cumulative, like if there's just much more that is known now and that's an input into future knowledge creation, does that make your lives as young economists easier or harder? Does it make it easier to do research today and come up with a big idea, or does it make it harder to come up with a big idea? And it's not maybe one answer. It may be easier in some ways and harder in others. And in one sense, certainly we have many more tools. Like there's a lot more known, and a lot of those things are tools. Like we can search the internet, we can look Google Scholar, we can read lots of papers. Now AI is a new tool. If you want to do econometric analysis, it's a lot easier doing it with like modern computers than like with punch cards on a mainframe, or before that, but trying to do it by hand. Writing down the matrices and inverting them. That's kind of a pain. So there's certain things, certain as tools make it seem like more productive, and also the constituent matter that we can build on is vast now. There's so much of it, and so we have kind of lots of opportunities to combine things maybe that are kind of new. On the other hand, and the thing I'm going to go in the direction of, Tatjana was emphasizing in particularly, but also this sort of niche idea that we were hearing before, is that there's just so much more known, right? And so it's harder to kind of get to the frontier because you have to kind of learn something of what's come before. And every year, every generation, there's more and more that has been discovered and known. In some sense, that's an accumulating mass of knowledge. And that's what I call the burden of knowledge, which has the effect of making people narrower in a sense. So let's think about that. So it's one of my earlier ideas in research, which I hope the burden of knowledge is an evocative way to think about it, remember it. But the question is, what happens if there is just an advancing stock of knowledge from the perspective of human capital accumulation and then ultimately innovative potential? And so think about it like this. We're born in every generation knowing nothing. Your mind is blank. You haven't been taught anything. It doesn't matter when you're born. You know certain things sort of instinctively, and then you have to go learn. But you're being born with every passing year in the modern era into a place with so much more biological knowledge, so much more statistical knowledge, mathematical knowledge of the known universe in many, many different dimensions. And so how can you respond to that? You're kind of born knowing nothing, and there's a bigger mountain of knowledge that you're sort of confronting. And so this kind of cumulativeness, you kind of have two kinds of options in your learning, if you will. One, you could just spend longer in school. You could just spend more time training as there's more to know. The second is you could say, I can't possibly know everything, so I'll just become much narrower, right? So maybe in going back, in Plato's time, inspiration may have been the same, and Aristotle could make all these contributions across the waterfront of knowledge at the time, but you can't really be a leading biologist even anymore. Biology is so many sub areas. A physicist, meaning what? You do cosmology, you study quantum, you study solid state physics and materials. These are very different math, very different sets of ideas that are at work. So people kind of get much narrower. And so if you think about that, it may be the case that still, computers are making us more productive, and there's lots of great ideas, and they make us sort of more creative, and inspiration is maybe quite the same in terms of a process. And yet, if we spend more of our life cycle training from that first force, we then have less time, other things equal, to innovate. So we kind of think of one person becoming educated, they're sort of spending, and this is true, we see this in the data. You used to get like a bachelor's degree would be the ultimate degree in electrical engineering, and then even back in the early 20th century, then there's a master's degree, then there's a PhD, now they do postdocs. So you spend much longer in your early years training. PhDs in economics, people spend much longer in them than they used to as well. But more importantly, maybe we're just narrower. And if you're narrower, that means that you probably kind of either the constituent matter that you can be inspired from is quite narrow. So it's not like you draw on all this knowledge. You're kind of doing some kind of combinatoric search based on things that that are kind of within your specialty. But also your ideas are probably kind of applicable to your specialty and may not be as broad in their impact because you yourself are narrow. So maybe that we're kind of all branching into these niches where our ideas are important in those niches, but there's so many more niches, and sort of your collective impact on, say, productivity as a whole in the economy as an individual researcher is low. You're going to hear from Chad next week about idea-based models for economic growth, and one of his main findings early in his career is that we seem to be putting a lot more effort into R&D, more people, more money, and kind of getting less out in terms of TFP growth per person or per dollar spent. So he's going to be talking about growth models that have that character, and you could think of this kind of narrowness effect of the burden of knowledge as one way to explain that kind of phenomenon. So in my early work on this, just to show you a couple of facts, so I had that idea when I was getting my PhD. I went out using patent data at the time, which is what we had, and looked at various patterns. So this upper picture is the age at which people get their first patent, and it looks like that's going up. Another version of this in another paper is the age at which people do Nobel Prize winning work. Not when they win the Nobel Prize, but when they do the research for which they would win the Nobel Prize, or people who are kind of the known technological inventors, like Thomas Edison and the light bulb, or Bell with the telephone. How old are they when they produce these signature contributions, technological advances? And you can basically see that the age at which people make those contributions is going up. And if you unpack all this, you're going to find that it's going up. It's basically going down in your 20s. You can still produce Nobel Prize winning insights in your 20s. It's just like much, much, much less common now than it used to be, and people are actually typically peaking kind of in their early 40s even in terms of these kind of massive contributions. If you look at the lower rows here, the one on the left is a measure of narrowness. It's actually looking at an inventor and saying, all right, let's get 2 patents in a row that they do and ask if they're likely to jump between one technology class of the patent to a new technology class. And what you see is that they're sort of less and less likely to jump with time, suggesting people's sort of ambit of research is more narrow. And then on the right is kind of one of our classic responses, which is if everyone's getting super narrow and niche, then what we might do is collaborate. We might work in teams to try to pull together complementary forms of expertise. And you see that too across kind of all forms of patenting and science. And not only that you see people moving more into teams, but you see that teams are increasingly the source of the higher impact work. Okay, so it used to be in a lot of fields like math, if you wrote alone, you would do better than if you worked with a co-author or in a team. But now we see that reverse. So even in like math today, you're gonna have a higher impact work if you work in a team than if you're working alone. So we see patterns kind of along this line, and in some sense, this is the part that maybe AI is going to make you guys very productive, and that's great, and lots of new tools. On the other hand, there is this sort of training niche challenge that you have to overcome, and our classic solution to that is collaboration, something you want to be thinking about. If you're really good at econometrics, but you're not really a theorist, or vice versa, rather than kind of butt your head against the wall the other thing, can you collaborate with someone who brings those complementary skills together with you and produce kind of a stronger paper and more producing more quickly as well, which is also a set of questions. Okay, we only have about, we're going to do maybe another 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'm going to we'll be done, and I'm going to have a happy hour with some members of this group. So the last piece I wanted to talk about were spillovers, and really start bringing us around further to the idea that this may be an incredibly high return activity, and that we may greatly underinvest in it, okay? And that's going to kind of open up the policy and institutional space to us. So I had 2 papers I was going to talk about. One was Bloom, Schankerman, and Van Reenen, which is looking at firms doing R&D and asking whether firms' R&D spills over to other firms, okay? And therefore what the returns are. Like obviously a firm investing its own money in R&D is trying to come up with better products or services or lower cost production methods or whatever, and they would capture the value of that themselves. But to the extent that they're putting in place new discoveries, new products, new services, other firms could learn about that, and then they would be inspired for spillovers to do it themselves, and that would not go to the private return of the firm. In fact, it might go against the private return of the firm because the other firms will now compete with them with imitative ideas. And so, Bloom, Schankerman, and Reenen is an Econometrica paper in 2013 that tries to pull apart a couple of key dimensions in those spillovers in a very clever and successful way. And I'm not going to, given the time, I'm going to go to the second paper. Also because you're going to hear from John Van Reenen directly later in the quarter. I think he's also going to talk about that paper, so let me not talk about it here today. But let me ask you a slightly different question about spillovers, okay? And so there are a number of spillovers at work in ideas. We started to talk about some of them, right? It's the non-rivalry. You produce some new idea, you get some value out of it, but then I see it, I can use the idea if it's not excluded through a patent, and then I get value out of it. But even if it was excluded through a patent, we think I could probably be inspired by your thing, and I could come up with my own version, which doesn't quite violate your patent, but still you inspired me and I got some of the value. That's kind of what we call an imitative spillover. Then there's the intertemporal component, like what if by producing, a new idea, like some mathematical idea, the next person can say, that inspires me to something else, and they're going to capture the value in some intertemporal sense. So that would be kind of another form of positive spillover from idea creation. And then there's of course always the thing that if you make something new and you sell it in a market, people are willing to pay for it. They're paying because they're getting value in excess of what they're paying. So the kind of downstream user or consumer of your ideas is also getting a kind of consumer surplus benefit from your creation that is not going to be captured by the creator. Okay, so there's several reasons to think that idea production would be undervalued. So the private inventor is getting less, or the scientist is getting less value personally than the social value that is created. On the other hand, there are a couple of forces that might go the other way. So for example, one feature among private sector players is what we call business stealing. So beyond imitation, let's take Amazon to be concrete. All right, so they're going to come up with a new business model based on, buying and selling things online and delivering them to you, right? And it's originally books, and they're going to basically kill a lot of existing bookstores, bricks and mortar kind of bookstores that find that they're not able to really compete with Amazon. So there's going to be a huge shrinkage in the bricks and mortar bookstore sector. Now, if you think about that, if you think of what the private returns to Amazon, they're doing something that is kind of valued by consumers, and there's some sort of social gain. That's why people kind of go to Amazon. On the other hand, the private return of Amazon is also just kind of a transfer from the existing bricks and mortar bookstores to Amazon selling them instead. All right, and that kind of transfer isn't a social gain. It's just like a transfer. Okay, they are basically stealing business from the existing bookstores, and so that could mean that the return to the investors in Amazon, in some sense, is too high. Right, because a lot of what they're getting is just stealing other people's business, but not really adding much that's much more efficient to society. Okay, so that kind of business stealing could be a negative spillover of innovation. It's part of the creative destruction idea that you'd see in Philippe Aghionn's work, who also won the Nobel in the fall, for example, and Peter Howitt worked together. And then the last one might be just kind of a racing phenomenon. If we're all different teams going after a superconducting material or a particular new drug that we have an idea about or something, if we're all these different research teams spending a lot of money and time in a race, it's kind of like a tournament, and one of us, say, gets the patent at the end or gets the discovery, then the effort of all the other teams may in some sense be partly wasted or maybe fully wasted, right? In which case, so in racing for certain opportunities, we may overinvest because we have a kind of a congestion externality or a crowding externality on each other, or duplication externality from the perspective of the research spend. So in reality, there's stories for positive spillovers, there's stories for negative spillovers. It's very much an empirical question. And papers like Bloom, Schankerman, and Van Reenen looking at business behavior kind of can net it out among the businesses in the sector and sort of say, look, it looks like on net a very positive spillover. But even that is quite limited, right? And so if you start thinking about it, for example, what firms are doing are not really science. So like, what about science, like math, or like what about physics, and what about all that's going on in universities? Is that's a trickier question. And the reason it's tricky is because for a lot of things, the spillovers are very diffuse, right? I mean, so I'm going to give you an example on the left. So here's 3 examples. So on the left, that equation, that's general relativity. That's Einstein, 1915, 1917, okay? Now you might say, what is the benefit of general relativity? It's a kind of a curiosity about the curvature of space-time. And you might think it's just kind of intriguing and that's neat, but it's not really useful. But actually it turns out that it's incredibly useful. It took a while. But for example, GPS satellites, which do global positioning, all have to, it works on atomic clocks that are very accurate, and those clocks have to be adjusted according to that equation because they're at lower gravity up in the air and they're moving at a speed compared to the surface of the Earth. It turns out that if you don't correct for general and special relativity from Einstein, the whole GPS system doesn't work. So in other words, if you think about like Uber, where we use GPS for drivers to find each other and also to navigate, like you don't get Uber unless you have the GPS system. You don't have the GPS system unless you have relativity. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, and that's like 100-year delay. But actually, someone mentioned math before, so that equation is an application of Riemannian geometry from like again like the 1860s, I think. So Riemann like came up with the geometry in math at the time seemed like it had no application. He was wondering about the geometry of spaces in more than 3 dimensions, which have curvature. Right? It's kind of this non-Euclidean curving geometry and high dimensionality, which seems completely like useless, right? Because we live in 3 dimensions, right? And things aren't curved. We can do everything in orthogonal planes or whatever. But it turned out that when it got to time and space, there was a 4th dimension, and it turned out that mass was curving them. So the actually appropriate mathematics 60 or 70 years later for Einstein was Riemann, and then that's going to lead to GPS, right? Okay. So in other words, if I were to ask you the question, what's the social value of Riemannian geometry or general relativity? It's even a hard question to think about because it's really long legs. Obviously you need it, it's kind of necessary, but it's not the only thing that's necessary to like the GPS system or Uber. So how would I allocate what value of all those mobile internet I could put back on these equations? I mean, it's very hard to think about, okay? The one in the middle is Taq polymerase. That's a protein that is the heart of polymerase chain reaction. And polymerase chain reaction is like the heart of basically all modern biotech. It's what allows you to amplify in a dish, like to make millions of copies of the same strand of DNA, which we use for any kind of genetic engineering or forensics or PCR, as you probably know from COVID tests. That was kind of the good COVID test is based on that protein. That protein was discovered by a couple of biologists in like a hot spring in Yellowstone. Okay, I mean, and at the time, it was just a curiosity. The organism it's in is a bacteria that lives in really high temperature. And it was kind of a biological curiosity. That was in the 1960s. It turned out that is going to basically unleash a decade or two later the entire biotech industry. And without that protein, you can't do it. So again, but I mean, of course, what's the social value of that research? This is now stuff that's being funded by a government science agency, right, etc. I put the iPhone up there because, again, on your own time, try to imagine enumerating the social value or cost, if you will, however you look at it, of the smartphone. It's complicated, right? Because there's so many things it touches. And so, like, how would I possibly begin to think about these spillovers and all these different margins, even from that one device? Okay, so it's very hard to do the social returns in some adequate way that gets at, maybe the more important the technology, the wider its use, probably the harder it is to measure, right? And so we don't want to like miss those. All right, so I want to close with just one idea on this space. This is a big literature on how to calculate the social returns to R&D or to science and these kinds of things. But I'm going to give you a kind of a conceptual take that's more macro, which I think will also help motivate you why what we're doing in this course is so important and why we need policies. Okay, so if we believe ideas are central to advancing prosperity, which I think there's a huge literature coming from many angles, which tells us is like without which we don't really grow among advanced economies over the long run, could we harness that insight to think about the social returns from kind of a big picture macro perspective? And the idea, this goes to a paper I did a few years ago, was to say, all right, well, under the thought experiment of like innovation and how our modern understanding of it, as well as endogenous growth and growth theory and macro in general, it's that we are, if you think of macro, the state variable is A, it's the state of knowledge. And if we don't improve it, we kind of stay the same, right? Like, so if we just had all the ideas we have now, like, things would keep breaking and we have investment because I have to fix the computer I'm on. It's like maybe based on today's experience, I need to get a new laptop. But your car will break down, your house will need windows repaired and the roof redone eventually. You're going to do investment just to kind of keep things going, but we wouldn't be getting better at stuff, right? and there's diminishing returns to capital investment. So it can't make us we can't just rely on savings and investment. We need to like improve the ideas. I mean, remember, no, we didn't get faster at transportation because of more wagons. We just have more and more wagons. No, we needed something much better than wagons. We keep improving them. Okay. And so what you can do as a thought experiment is say, all right, well, imagine we just stopped innovating. If we just stopped innovating, we would sort of stay where we are, right? That's sort of what would happen. We would just kind of replace what breaks and we'd stay where we are. And you can use that insight to kind of create a overall calculation of the social returns to R&D under some assumptions that you can then play with that reveals kind of an average returns to the investment in research and development. And then you can also, having done it, I'll show you the very simple baseline, and then you can try to generalize it to confront a lot of other forces that you might think are important to deal with as well beyond the simple baseline. And then you could also think about how it relates to micro evidence or other kinds of macro evidence as well. So, but here's the thought experiment I want you to just stare at. And this kind of gets at, it's got non-rivalry in here, it's got a whole bunch of things. It's got temporal spillovers, imitation, all that stuff. It's kind of netting it all together. So look at the upper row here. What I want you to imagine is that you're investing on the green line a certain amount of your total GDP or your resources into R&D or innovative activity, however you want to measure that. Okay, so if it's R&D is like just under, say, 3% of GDP goes into R&D in most advanced economies, 2 to 3%, say. Okay, so and you're kind of following the green line, and then I want you just to go onto the black line, and for 1 year you're going to go onto this alternative line where everyone stops. We stop the course. You guys go home, you work somewhere else for a while. The labs, we just put some sheets over the equipment and we stop, okay? And then a year later, we come back and we pull the sheets off the equipment and we just keep going on exactly the same projects that we were doing before. We just had a year-long delay. So we don't change the pathway of discovery. It's the same projects and the same intertemporal set of projects. They'll inspire the same things, but we just kind of wait a year. We just kind of delay it a year. Okay, and so the cost of we'd save a bunch of money by not having to do it for a year, if you will. Okay, that's what we invest in innovation. All right, that's the top line. The next line is what would happen to growth in a simple model. Well, in a simple model, if we don't advance the state of knowledge, we just stay at the same standard of living, right? So we'd be kind of growing at, say, like, most economies, like advanced economies, like 2% per year, say, and then we wouldn't grow for a year in the middle column, and then in the middle row, and then we just grow again on exactly the same path because we're doing exactly the same set of ideas and discovery. In other words, to put this in income per capita terms in the lowest row, you'd be kind of growing at a log scale, like 2% per year, kind of going up. And then for a year, you wouldn't grow at all. You wouldn't get poor. You just sort of didn't advance ideas. And then you would sort of advance ideas again at the same rate as before. All right? All right, so if you can see that, right, those are the things. So what's the cost and what's the benefit? Well, it says that if you invest about 2 to 3% of your GDP in a given year, right, you would be 2% richer forever. Because you would grow that year and you'd keep it. You don't forget the ideas. They don't depreciate. We still know algebra, right? So basically, the value of that is this kind of green wedge in the lowest row. You're going to be, in every future period, you're going to be 2% richer if you invested in those ideas than if you didn't. Okay? What's the present value of being, G% richer in every period? Well, its present value of that is G over R, where R is some discount rate. So in other words, you invest a share X over Y of your resources. That's the cost in R&D for a year, and you get to be G over R richer in present value terms. Okay, so that's the thought experiment. And again, there's maybe a lot of imitation, there's business dealing going on, all sorts of things are going on in a given year of R&D. Firms of entrepreneurship, they're destroying each other, some are winning, some are losing, many drugs fail, some win, but on net, we kind of get like 1.8% or 2% richer per year, and that kind of gives us the net of all of that effort. Okay, so the present value of the benefits is G over R, the cost of investment is X over Y from a share of resources, and so that's kind of the social benefit cost ratio, all right? Now, just think about this intuitively. Again, X over Y is like 2 to 3% of GDP. But you're 2 to 3% richer, 2% richer next year and the year after forever. So that's kind of an amazing thing, right? Because you push up the level of ideas today, you kind of get that benefit forever, if you think of it like that. And you push it up seemingly quite a bit, given our R&D investment. So what do you get from that kind of a calculation? So G is something like 1.8%, more accurately in the US. X over Y is 2.7%. So you can pick your discount rate, but if I take a 5% discount rate, look in that table below, you'll see it says 13.3. That means for every dollar we spend on R&D, we get $13 back in present value, which is, of course, incredibly high. It's like a machine. You put in $1, you get all this money back, okay? And the logic is, what's driving that, again, is because you push up the level and people generations from now are going to be smarter because there's Riemannian geometry. I'm able to figure out how to use it, in fact. But like the ideas don't go away. You just kind of push things up and it stays there. And it turns out we don't spend that much. Now, maybe you think R&D formally measured is more than 2.7%. Maybe there's a lot of innovation happening other ways and it's sort of badly measured. And so this whole paper is really about making this baseline calculation and then trying to kill it by making all sorts of different assumptions, right? And so you could sort of put an adjustment factor I call beta in front of that ratio. So why would my $13 per dollar be too high? One might, it might be because there's lags. Like I invest now, but I don't really get the growth right now. I get it particularly for science sometime in the future. Maybe because I have to embody the ideas in physical capital. These new ideas have to go into a smartphone. I have to spend on the smartphone. And maybe because other sources of innovation are out there, not just sort of people doing kind of formal R&D. On the other hand, there's a bunch of reasons that baseline might be too low. One is because in macro, we think that inflation is actually lower than we say, because there's a kind of a new goods bias if you follow that literature. And so actually growth is higher than 1.8% in real terms. Maybe it's more like 2.3%, 2.5%. So that makes the returns to R&D even higher. One, because we don't actually value health directly in GDP. Like a lot of research is trying to make you healthier and live longer, not to make higher income per capita based out of productivity on the job. And also international spillovers. If the US does say R&D or some other country does a lot of R&D, other countries can learn as well. So we're kind of a net exporter of ideas. And so the gain in standards of living can be far beyond your own borders. So, you can balance these forces out, you can try. The conclusion is that it's really hard to get the number of the benefit to be small compared to the cost. Whatever you do, however you try to attack this, basically. And we actually said that kind of on the very conservative end, it's like you get $4 or $5 out per dollar, all right? So this is a method where you're trying to calculate the average return. Now we could have a much longer conversation about this paper, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna bring things to a close. You can of course read the paper to look at all sorts of arguments in it. And you're going to hopefully hear from John Van Reenen about the other paper I was going to talk about. I know it's on his reading list. Okay, but so where would that leave us? I mean, so this is one version of the social returns. There's many, many papers about the social returns to R&D doing different approaches, including a couple of very new ones, one of which Fieldhouse and Mertens is really about public investment in R&D alone in science, and it's showing incredibly high returns. Not every paper agrees, of course, but what you tend to see across a whole wide range of methods is repeatedly calculating very high social rates of return to idea creation. The paper I just showed you gives you some of that logic because you kind of push things up, in a meaningful way that you benefit from in a future stream from your investments today. Okay, so in light of that, it seems like, wow, they're really high social returns. Now, interestingly, a lot of these papers are going to show higher returns on the margin. Like if we did another $1 billion of basic science, it's like going to be really, really valuable for society. And so that means that both we're going to have a bunch of institutions that are going to hopefully try to push on this, but also probably that they are currently way underfunded compared to their social benefit. And even conditional on their funding, do we have a good idea about the best way to design a science grant, or the best way to design the patent system, or the best way to run a university, right? Or the best way to create incentives for human capital, like the tenure system, or how we give credit. I mean, all of these things are very, very open. Okay, so the kinds of questions in the bigger picture are here, what are those policies? What are the right institutional structures? How should we design and fund these various systems? And so there's a big policy question. And then sort of more in a positive sense, there's just a lot of questions about understanding idea creation that are really interesting from a personal perspective and private sector perspective. Who captures how do you capture value from an idea? Where do you get excludability? Who gets credit? Uncertainty you guys brought up, and I talked about it a little bit. How does that affect our ability to produce ideas, to exchange ideas? There's some really interesting breakdowns in the market for ideas because of uncertainty between buyers and sellers. There's a lot of strategic interactions in markets, et cetera, in the production of ideas. And there's a really big question. We had a question about inspiration before, like, where do big ideas come from? Like, who produces them? How do they come up? What are they doing? Like, what is one scholar doing versus another scholar versus an inventor versus an entrepreneur? Does someone just have a better process? Like, what is that process? Are they better incentives? Like, what are those incentive systems? AI, you've asked about, what's the role of AI in all this? It's coming at us very fast. Is it going to fundamentally change how we do things? These are kind of all of the questions, on the table. So let me just close. I can take any last questions. Trying to motivate you a little bit. So I want to first, I try to get across how important this subject is. I really think So in other words, if the social returns to R&D are high, the social returns to R&D about ideas are very, very, very high. Because if you can make this system more efficient, the returns to that for society are vast. Okay, it's important. Okay, the second is it's not an area where we're just studying it because it's curious and markets get it right. It needs interventions, and there's so many kinds of interventions. It's a very complicated space, and there's so much to be learned at a very micro level to more industry or sector levels to macro levels about how to do that well, and that's going to require just great research. And the third thing I would say, which I haven't said to you yet, is this is a growing area with amazing data. Okay, this is not, when I started out doing this long ago now, there was patent data. There was no data on papers and scientists. There was no real good data on entrepreneurs, right? There wasn't really data on funders and who's funding what. We didn't have full text of anything. And between the data sets that have emerged and the tools that have emerged in parallel, both our classic econometric tools and compute that we have, but also now all these manifold AI tools, et cetera, in addition to our kind of causal identification tools and structural tools that we have in economics, it is a vast opportunity, and there's theoretical opportunities as well. I actually have gotten to the point where it's like every single data set I touch, I'm like, wow, I could spend the next 15 years on this data set, and then I have to go over to something else. There's so much data. We're not lacking in data. So there's and so another way to say that is, I think our scarcity right now in innovation and economics of innovation is not opportunity, it's not data, it's not even theoretical, it's people. We need more people on that mountain figuring it out. And I think there's just great opportunities to find your own niche and little place that are of great interest to the whole community on that mountain. So I hope this course, more than anything else it does, in addition to giving a taste of what people are doing at the frontier and some of the core questions, can inspire you to realize just how much great work there's to be done. And I hope we can attract you into this research community.